At just 19 years old, Percy June Hutton sealed his fate with a violent crime that left no room for redemption. A teenager with his whole life ahead of him. Yet in one brutal moment, he made a decision that led him straight to death row. Now, decades later, his final reckoning is set. June 18, 2025 will be the day the state of Ohio ensures he never walks free again. It was 1986 in Cleveland, Ohio, when Percy June Hutton became a murderer. A dispute over money escalated into pure bloodshed when Hutton turned on his victim, Derek "Ricky" Mitchell. What started as an argument over a mere $10 debt exploded into a calculated execution. Hutton pulled out a gun and shot Mitchell in cold blood, but he didn't stop there. As if ensuring there were no loose ends, he then turned his weapon on a second man, William Hodges, shooting him twice. Hodges barely survived, but the trauma of that night never left him. With Mitchell dead and Hodges critically wounded, police wasted no time. Witness testimonies and forensic evidence pointed directly to Hutton, and he was arrested shortly after. During the trial, Hodges, the surviving victim, testified against him, sealing his fate. The prosecution painted a picture of a ruthless young man with no regard for human life. In 1987, the jury wasted little time in reaching a verdict. Hutton was convicted of aggravated murder and attempted murder, and he was sentenced to death. Over the years, he filed multiple appeals, arguing ineffective legal representation and flaws in the sentencing process. But each appeal was denied. For nearly 4 decades, Hutton has waited in a prison cell, watching the years slip away as his execution date drew nearer. Now, at 58 years old, Percy June Hutton has exhausted all legal options. No last-minute appeals, no chance at clemency. On June 18, 2025, the state of Ohio will carry out his execution. Lethal injection will be the method, bringing an end to the life of a man who, at just 19, set himself on a path of no return. Demetrius Taryn Frazier. At just 19 years old, Frazier committed a brutal and senseless act that left an entire community horrified. The 1991 rape and murder of Pauline Brown was one of the most gruesome cases Alabama had ever seen. Brown, a 25-year-old woman, was walking home late at night in Birmingham when Frazier attacked her from behind, dragged her into a secluded alley, and subjected her to unimaginable cruelty. Brown fought for her life, scratching and clawing at her attacker, but Frazier beat her savagely, breaking multiple bones in the process. He then sexually assaulted her, leaving her battered and bloody. Not satisfied, he wrapped a belt around her neck and strangled her until she stopped breathing. Her lifeless body was discovered the next morning, dumped like garbage. Frazier thought he had gotten away with it, but he left behind a critical piece of evidence, his fingerprints on Brown's clothing. Witnesses also placed him in the area that night, and police soon tracked him down. When officers confronted him, he showed no remorse, claiming he did what he had to do. Frazier was convicted in 1993 and sentenced to death. His appeals stretched for decades, delaying his execution multiple times, but the evidence was undeniable, and no court was willing to overturn the verdict. For over 30 years, he sat on death row, filing motion after motion, hoping for a way out, but time has run out. Now 52 years old, Demetrius Frazier will be executed by nitrogen hypoxia on February 6, 2025. Alabama will place a mask over his face, replacing oxygen with nitrogen, until he loses consciousness and dies. Moises Sandoval Mendoza. The murder of Rel O'Neal Tolson in 2004 was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The victim was found beaten, stabbed, and left to die, and the man responsible, Moises Sandoval Mendoza, who was barely an adult at that time, left behind a trail of blood and terror. Mendoza brutally attacked, tortured, and killed his victim in a crime so savage it left investigators shaken. The crime took place in Houston, Texas in 2004. What started as a dispute quickly spiraled into a scene of pure horror. Mendoza wasn't content with a quick killing. He wanted complete control over his victim's final moments. First, he beat Tolson mercilessly, leaving his face bruised and bloodied. Then came the knives, multiple stab wounds, deep and deliberate, designed to cause maximum pain. By the time Mendoza was done, blood covered the room. Tolson's body was left mangled, with deep lacerations and internal injuries. The brutality wasn't just excessive, it was sadistic. Mendoza made one crucial mistake. He bragged about the killing. He told friends and associates about what he had done, showing zero remorse. Word spread fast, and soon, an anonymous tip led police straight to his door. When officers searched his apartment, they found blood-stained clothing, weapons, and DNA evidence linking him to the crime. There was no escape. Mendoza was caught red-handed. During his trial, Mendoza showed no emotion as prosecutors detailed the horrors of his crime. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury didn't take long to decide his fate. For over 20 years, Mendoza has fought to delay the inevitable. He's claimed wrongful conviction, argued about legal representation, and even tried to appeal on technicalities. But nothing has worked. Now, his time is finally running out. On April the 23rd, 2025, Mendoza will be executed by lethal injection inside a Texas prison. Samuel Moreland. Samuel Moreland was young when he became a killer, young enough that he could have chosen another path. But on one horrifying night in 1985, he made sure there was no turning back. The horror unfolded in Dayton, Ohio, on November 1st, 1985. Moreland, then just a young man, entered the home of his girlfriend, Jeannie McGraw, in a fit of rage. Armed with a .32 caliber revolver, he unleashed pure terror on the household. His victims, 5 people, including children. McGraw, along with her mother, young daughter, and 2 others, were shot in cold blood. The crime scene was gruesome, bodies riddled with bullets, the walls stained with blood. One child survived, but was left permanently traumatized. Moreland showed no mercy, executing his victims as if they meant nothing. With multiple bodies left behind and a lone survivor to tell the story, it didn't take long for police to track Moreland down. Witnesses confirmed he had been at the house, and forensic evidence quickly pointed to him as the killer. When he was arrested, Moreland denied everything, but the brutality of the murders left no room for doubt. His trial became one of the most disturbing in Ohio's history. The jury didn't hesitate. They convicted him of 5 counts of aggravated murder, and in 1986, he was sentenced to death. For nearly 40 years, Moreland has fought to escape execution. He's appealed countless times, arguing everything from ineffective counsel to mental illness. None of it worked. The courts have upheld his sentence at every turn. On July 30th, 2025, Ohio will put an end to his fight. Lethal injection awaits him, bringing justice for the 5 lives he stole in one of the state's most horrifying massacres. Richard Lee Tabler. Tabler, a young man with all his life ahead of him, carried out a vicious execution-style killing spree in Killeen, Texas in 2004. His targets? Nightclub employees and bouncers, men he claimed were disrespectful and needed to be taught a lesson. On November 26, 2004, Tabler lured Mohammed Amineh Rahman, 28, and Haitham Zayed, 25, to an empty field under the pretense of discussing nightclub business. Once they arrived, he forced them to kneel before shooting each of them execution-style in the head. But Tabler wasn't done. He then hunted down 2 other men, Fars Budag, 23, and Wasim Shamia, 26, both also connected to the club. The brutal murders sent a wave of fear through the local community. Tabler might have evaded justice longer, if not for his own arrogance. Days after the killings, he called a local newspaper, boasting about what he had done. That reckless move led police straight to him. When authorities arrived at his apartment, he surrendered without a fight. During interrogation, Tabler laughed while describing the murders, showing zero remorse. His own accomplice, a teenage friend, later testified against him. In 2007, a Texas jury took less than 2 hours to convict Tabler of capital murder. He was sentenced to death with no possibility of parole. For nearly 2 decades, Tabler has sat on death row, filing countless appeals, all rejected. At one point, he even demanded his own execution, but later changed his mind, trying to delay it again. On February 13, 2025, Tabler, strapped to the gurney, faced lethal injection, and within minutes, his body went still. Edward Thomas James. James committed one of the most horrific crimes in Castleberry, Florida, when he murdered his landlord, Betty Dick, and her 8-year-old granddaughter, Toni Neuner. On September 19, 1993, inside the quiet neighborhood of Seminole County, Florida, James turned a family home into a blood-soaked crime scene. It began with Toni, an innocent child sleeping in her room. James snuck in, placed his hands around her neck, and began to squeeze. The little girl fought for her life, but she was no match for him. Once she was unconscious, he sexually assaulted her. By the time he was done, she was lifeless. The commotion woke Betty, Rushing to save her granddaughter, she came face to face with a monster. James grabbed 2 knives and launched a frenzied attack, stabbing Betty over 20 times. The wounds were deep, the violence unimaginable. By the time police arrived, the house was covered in blood, and the bodies of Betty and Tony lay motionless. James thought he could get away. He stole Betty's car and fled, leaving behind the massacre he had created. But his freedom didn't last long. Authorities tracked the stolen vehicle and quickly apprehended him. Inside the car, they found Tony's blood, along with items stolen from the home. The evidence was damning. Once in custody, DNA and fingerprint analysis removed any doubt. James was the killer. Faced with overwhelming evidence, James knew he had no escape. He pleaded guilty, hoping to avoid the death penalty, but the court showed no mercy. The death sentence was final. There would be no second chances. For years, James has fought to delay his execution, filing appeal after appeal, but no court has granted him relief. On March 20th, 2025, James will face the final reckoning. He will be strapped to a gurney, an IV inserted into his arm. Within moments, the lethal injection will do its work, and the man who showed no mercy to his victims will fade into nothingness. James Dennis Ford. Some crimes are so brutal, so inhuman, that they demand the ultimate punishment. That was the case for James Dennis Ford, whose ruthless double homicide shocked the entire state of Florida in 1997. On a quiet summer night in Orlando, Gregory and Kimberly Malnery were relaxing in their home when Ford and an accomplice burst in, armed and ready to kill. Ford had planned a robbery, but things spiraled into bloodshed. He tied up Gregory Malnery, forcing him to watch as Kimberly was brutally beaten and tortured. Then, with zero hesitation, Ford shot Gregory point-blank in the head. His lifeless body collapsed onto the living room floor. Kimberly, begging for her life, was stabbed repeatedly in the chest. But Ford wasn't finished. He slashed her throat, ensuring she wouldn't survive. The couple's terrified neighbors heard screams, but by the time police arrived, the Malnorys were dead and Ford had vanished. Ford may have thought he was untouchable, but he left too much evidence behind. Investigators found his fingerprints on the duct tape used to restrain Gregory. Security cameras also captured Ford using Kimberly's stolen credit card just hours after the murders. Within days, police tracked him to a motel in Miami. When they burst into the room, Ford reached for a gun, but officers overpowered him before he could fire. His life as a free man ended right there. Ford's trial in 1999 was swift. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict him of double homicide, armed robbery, and torture. At 64 years old, James Dennis Ford took his last breath on February 13, 2025, after Florida administered lethal injection. Wendell Arden Grom. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening in Oklahoma City, but on that night in 2005, a home invasion turned into a horrific execution-style murder. The crime took place in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, in 2005. A once safe neighborhood was left shaken by the brutal murder that unfolded behind closed doors. Grom broke into the home under the cover of night, intending to steal valuables. But when the homeowner unexpectedly came face to face with him, Grom didn't hesitate. He forced the victim to kneel, holding a gun to their head. There was no struggle, no chance for escape, just a cold, calculated execution. A single gunshot rang out, and the homeowner collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Instead of fleeing immediately, Grom ransacked the house, taking what he could before disappearing into the night. It was a robbery turned into murder, with no concern for human life. For weeks, Grom thought he had gotten away with it, but the police were closing in fast. Witnesses reported a suspicious vehicle, and security footage from a nearby store placed Grom at the scene shortly before the murder. The real breakthrough came when Grom tried to sell stolen items from the house, leading investigators straight to him. Once arrested, forensic evidence, including gunshot residue on his hands and stolen property in his possession, sealed his fate. During his trial, the prosecution painted Grom as a ruthless killer who saw his victim as nothing more than an obstacle in his way. The jury agreed. Grom was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Grom has spent nearly 2 decades fighting his execution, filing appeal after appeal. His legal team has argued ineffective counsel and even mental illness, but every attempt has failed. With no options left, the state of Oklahoma is finally moving forward with his execution. On March 20th, 2025, Grom's time runs out. Inside Oklahoma's death chamber, he will be executed by lethal injection. No more appeals, no more delays. Marion Bowman. At just 20 years old, Marion Bowman committed a brutal, senseless crime that shocked the people of South Carolina in 2001. His victims never saw it coming. A seemingly normal day turned into a nightmare of bloodshed and violence, leaving families devastated and a town in mourning. Bowman wasn't a known criminal. He wasn't on law enforcement's radar. But on that fateful day, something inside him snapped. The attack was vicious, leaving his victims mutilated beyond recognition. The sheer level of violence suggested a personal motive or deep-rooted rage, but authorities struggled to understand why. The crime scene was so horrific that even seasoned investigators were shaken. Bowman didn't cover his tracks well. The brutality of the murders left overwhelming evidence behind, and within days, investigators had enough to place him at the crime scene. A key witness also came forward, connecting him directly to the murder weapons and stolen items. When confronted, he showed no emotion, no remorse. Bowman was brought to trial in 2002, facing multiple counts of first-degree murder. His defense tried to argue mental instability, but the jury saw through it. The prosecution presented a chilling narrative of unprovoked violence, and in just a few hours of deliberation, Bowman was sentenced to death. Over the years, he attempted appeal after appeal, claiming mishandling of evidence and arguing that his age at the time should have spared him. But the courts weren't convinced. His execution date was set. Now 44 years old, Bowman had spent over 2 decades on death row. On January 31, 2025, South Carolina carried out his sentence. The execution chamber was silent as the lethal injection was administered, marking the final moments of a case that had lingered in the justice system for years. With his death, the legal battle came to an end. But for the families of his victims, the memories of his crimes will never fade. Stephen LaWayne Nelson. Pastor Clint Dobson was a man of faith, kindness, and compassion. But none of that mattered when Stephen LaWayne Nelson walked into North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas, on March 3, 2011. Nelson was 24 years old at the time, and what started as a robbery turned into a cold-blooded execution. Nelson's plan was simple: break into the church, steal what he could, and leave. But once inside, something changed. He attacked Pastor Dobson with terrifying force, beating him savagely before wrapping a plastic bag around his head. He then strangled him to death. A church secretary was also present that day. Nelson brutally assaulted her, beating her unconscious and leaving her for dead. Miraculously, she survived. But that wasn't enough for Nelson. Before fleeing, he ransacked the church, stealing anything of value, including Dobson's laptop and car. Authorities quickly linked Nelson to the stolen car. Just days after the murder, he was caught and arrested. But what stunned everyone was his reaction. Nelson laughed, bragged, and even mocked the pain of his victims. During police interrogations, he showed no regret, no empathy. His behavior in custody only confirmed what many feared. He enjoyed the suffering he caused. By the time Nelson's trial started in 2012, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury heard gruesome details of Pastor Dobson's agonizing final moments, and the surviving church secretary testified against him. The prosecution didn't hold back. This was a man who killed without hesitation, without remorse, and if given the chance, he would do it again. The jury agreed. In a swift decision, Nelson was sentenced to death. But even behind bars, Nelson's violent tendencies didn't stop. Over the years, he was caught assaulting guards, threatening fellow inmates, and bragging about his crimes. Multiple appeals were denied, and with every failed legal challenge, his fate became clearer. Now 37 years old, Nelson was executed by lethal injection on February 5, 2025, in Huntsville, Texas, the state's execution capital. The chamber doors closed, the witnesses looked on, and within minutes his sentence was carried out. For the family of Pastor Clint Dobson, the wait had been long, but on that day, justice was finally served.